But almost said good morning. Good afternoon, people. Welcome to Writing Technology into Your Stories. From my perspective, my name is Brett Cousins. I write historical fiction, and for me, research is everything. And that includes the technology you use in your books, either historical or science fiction or contemporary. The presentation today is going to basically pound you over the head with research. Let me get my screen up here. Share the screen. Make sure I use the right one. Share the screen. And there we go. I put that at the beginning of all my things. Let's see how okay, so it's going to be that way. Give me a second. I got to go to another laptop and boom. Boom. There we go. Slide 2. Sort of the subtext is, don't use an automatic rifle in the 17th century unless you were time traveling. Now, there's technology can be a major part of the story, or it could be just something that you're putting in for flavor. Either way, it should be relatively accurate for the time period or the situation that you're in. So that would be able to use it effectively and realistically in the story. It has to exist in the time period, and you got to know how it works. And in science fiction, it's good if you can extrapolate from existing technology into this new time period that you're dealing with. Inventing stuff right off the top of your head as opposed to saying like you're doing robotics. Take a look at, do the research on what robotics is now and how it's evolved to what it is and how AI is starting to develop, and then you can extrapolate from there. And that takes, I call my major word here, research. So I'm going to come up with a few examples. Why have I got to click this so many times? That's really odd. Okay, there's 4 streams that I'm going to be following here. The technology, you look at the research, you research the history of technology. When was it invented? How was it used? When did they stop using it? Because it was, and it evolved into something else or something better came along and then they stopped using it. We look at new and developing technology. This is where you take a look at what's happening now and be able to extrapolate into the future for your science fiction novel. How the tech works is very important. If you're going to describe a piece of technology, you know how it works. You don't have to get really down into the details, but the basic premise behind how it works gives you some great details to put into a book. And again, extrapolation of the scientific theories to make your technology in the future work much more effectively and be more realistic. The advancement of civilization has basically only followed 4 main threads through history. Technology development in weapons, transportation, agriculture, and building. Weapons, of course, were used to defend or attack your enemies. And whoever came up with the better weapons ends up winning generally. In the case of transportation, people used to walk everywhere. And then one day somebody realized you could train a horse to ride on. And then they invented wagons, invented the wheel. They decided that making roads were better than just going across country all the time. Especially if you keep going in the same place all the time, you start making your own road. It evolved then into basically looking at horses until almost the 20th century when you get the trains in the 19th century. So the inventive steam power that allowed trains to happen and start, and then the piston engine, you started with the car, and then people learned how to plane. So transportation technology is a key to the advancement of civilization. Agriculture as well. Basically, civilization started from your hunter-gatherer groups when they learned to grow crops. Wheat is a big thing. Egypt became a power because it grew wheat. And hence you were able to feed a city of thousands of people as opposed to your village of 42. So agriculture, advancements in agriculture is what drove not only civilization, but the number of people capable of actually surviving. And the fourth is building. They start in caves. They find out that they actually chop down wood and make a hut. Sometimes it was just a lean-to, started in the buildings. And then they started working with stone. And hence you started with building like in about 3000 BC. They started building the pyramids. I think in the Bible, the first real city with stone walls and that to defend itself was Nineveh, which I'm never really sure where it was in the Middle East. But then, building technologies improved. And you can even look at this in warfare, like castles were used to defend against armies because you had a wall, you could shoot down at them, everything was fine. You could defend yourself quite well. And then somebody invented, going back to the weapons, somebody invented a trebuchet and started throwing rocks at your wall. Well, you just made the wall sicker. Then somebody invented a cannon. Suddenly walls weren't such a big thing anymore. And you'll find that basically around the 1500s, they stopped putting up elaborate wall systems around cities. Most of the walls around walled cities predate around the 1500s, 1600s. As you progress further, you find people start making buildings with steel structures. Glass is used a lot more, and then you have your modern skyscrapers and the architecture and the technology that goes into that. So those four streams basically drove civilization through the centuries. Okay, so I'm going to start with weapons. The evolution is hunting and warfare. When the man first went hunting, they basically tried to chase down something and choke it to death. Then somebody figured you could actually work faster if you picked up a rock and hit it over the head with. So your first weapon is a rock, especially when George got, pissed you off, so you got a rock and you hit him with it. To get more momentum, somebody invented a club. And so when you swing it, you had more momentum, there was more force at the end. You also didn't have to get as close to a possibly dangerous animal to hit it. Like when hitting a bear with a rock, you got to be right there. With a club, you got some reach. The next stage is spear. Now you not only can be further away, you can actually be farther back again and throw it. And because you know what the rocks are like, you can stick that on the end to have more impact when they hit. Then somebody invented the bow and arrow. So again, now you can be even farther back again. And when you learn archery, you can be pretty accurate at a greater distance. Civilization finally developed metallurgy, and you had basically the Bronze Age around 3300 BC. Bronze is basically a copper tin mixed alloy with a few other things in it because they weren't, overly perfect in their metallurgy techniques. But you can make a sword, which was, stronger than a piece of wood. And so you now had a weapon that was superior to any other weapon someone else would have. And, then from there you went from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Now you had a stronger sword that you could break the bronze sword with, so you had the advantage. Swords and spears and bows and arrows basically were, in various versions of those, like crossbows, were the were the stalwarts of weaponry up until gunpowder. It was 8th century China, they developed gunpowder, and they used it for rockets and fireworks and stuff until some general found out he could propel stuff really fast at his enemy with gunpowder. It didn't make it to Europe till about the 13th century. And it's still debated whether it came from China or some monk invented it in France or something. And gunpowder drove the evolution of basically handheld weapons, cannons, the whole works, all the way up to the 20th century. And the next, and the last stage that we're in is basically a chemical weapon, looking at nuclear. Fission was first understood in 1939, and then the race was on to make an atom bomb. This is something that didn't use a propellant to fire something at someone else. This was something that you just let it go and an entire city would be leveled. So this is how the evolution of weapons was through the centuries. How to use the weapons. This again is a part of being able to be realistic. A rock you could hit, throw, and then there's a slingshot. You got to remember David and Goliath in the Bible. He was just a shepherd and he threw a slingshot. In actual fact, if you look at history, slingshot throwers were quite common in armies back in those days. Because they were basically, well, you had the bows and arrows, but these guys, you would have a whole squad of them, and they were very accurate how to throw those rocks with a slingshot. Basically, it was a little pouch and a rope, and you whipped it around and you let it go. And so that's where the rock became more of a projectile. And then with the club, you had the greater reach. The spear was a stick that you could throw. The bow and arrow was the distance killing. You started getting more technical skill requirements now. Like when you throw a spear, you just throw it in the general direction. With bow and arrow, you have to start developing technical skill. If you don't know how you do archery, your arrow's not going to go very far and it's not going to go where you want it to. So now you have a weapon that starts requiring technical skill, especially if you're going to be firing from like a moving chariot. The Mongols were very good with archery, firing from horseback. They were the first guys to actually do that en masse. You move to the sword. You swing, you stick, you hack, you guard, deflect. Again, handling a sword required skill and technique. So this is something you had to learn. You can't just pick up a sword and be an expert with it. If you're up against someone that knows how to use a sword and you don't, having a sword, even if it's a superior sword, isn't going to help you. And gunpowder. First thing you got to do is don't blow yourself up. And cannons and guns, explosives, again, require skill to use properly. If you're going to be playing with a gun and in your technology, with someone who's never fired a gun before, they won't understand how the kick is. When you fire the gun, it kicks back. Do they know where the safety is? If the safety's on, you're never even going to be able to fire it. What kind of gun is it? The larger caliber has more kick. They're going to be able to fire it properly. It requires skill and training to use guns properly. And the funny thing about nuclear bombs, they're not overly that technical. It took a lot of research and understanding to figure out how much plutonium or uranium you needed to actually make the explosion. But the actual mechanical works of a nuclear bomb are not that complicated. However, stealing nuclear weapons in a story is extremely hard to do. They're just, these are not just lying around. I remember visiting the Chalk River nuclear power site. It's north of Ottawa, it's north of Pembroke. And we were students at the time, and one of the students asked, "Oh, what if someone comes in here and wants to steal the plutonium?" And he says, "Oh, we give it to him and watch him die as he runs away." So there's even a technical skill to handling nuclear materials. And you get a big boom, but the delivery mechanism requires skill and technology. So if you're going to write a nuclear thriller, you have to understand the ins and outs of how the bomb works. Technically, it's not that complicated, but how you're going to deliver it to the target you want, which is a lot more complicated. Not to mention how you're going to get the bomb built in the first place. You're going to find the materials and that to do that. We'll go on to transportation. Again, technology develops in transportation. You walk, you can do 20 miles a day. Even in the 1800s, when guys were, got their horses and their wagons and they were, going to find a new homestead in, I don't know, Nebraska or something, and they do the wagon trains. Most people, you had all your stuff on the wagon. You had one guy guiding the wagon with the horses. Most of the rest of the family still walked. And so when you have people walking, you're pretty well topped out at 20 miles a day because you're going to stop, you're going to drink. Especially if you don't have a wagon and horses and stuff. You got to carry everything yourself. And then you got to look at the terrain you got to walk over. The maximum just across a prairie was 20 miles a day. It could be even less if you're in the mountain, well, a lot less when you're in the mountains. The technological advance from walking is a wheel. And so you can now make a cart, and hence you can now carry more stuff by pulling the cart. The advancement after that would be the animal, hooking an ox or a horse up to pull the cart for you. And of course, then you can realize that you can actually ride the horse, and the horse can run for miles before getting tired. Hence, you can ride faster, and somebody invents the chariot. The case of horses, you can walk 20 miles a day, but in cavalry, if you have a cavalry unit, they can go a lot farther. If they push it, they can almost make 50 miles. Generally, you only go about 30 miles a day on horseback, because it's basically your horse you'll wear your horse out if you do that too often. If you do more than 20 miles a day too often. But for a single day, a cavalry unit can actually go maybe up to 50. But if you're going to go into battle right after riding 50 miles, your horse is going to go, no. And horses can be stubborn. The next technology is, okay, we want to go over the land. Well, the first bridge would have been 2 logs. Well, the first bridge would have been 1 log until somebody realized you put 2 logs together and they won't roll around on you. And the people would have made a raft to go across small bodies of water. You get across bigger types, you end up having to build a ship. In the case of the Vikings were very prolific traveling over oceans. Nobody really traveled in Roman times. They traveled in the Mediterranean, and they had sailing ships, but they never went very far. They usually kept close to the coast. They went from hop to hop and hop and hop. No one really crossed the middle of the Mediterranean that often. The Vikings were the guys and they were using oars in Roman times too. The Vikings built their long ships to be able to handle going out on the ocean. And hence they were able to go farther afield. Plus, with the shallow draft, they ran up rivers. And eventually boats started having sails. So when you wanted to go somewhere particular, you had the oars out. But when you're just cruising over a distance, you could put the sails up and give the rowers a break. Then in 1698, somebody invented a steam engine. And it was mostly using for pumping water out of mines initially. James Watt in 1775 made a steam engine that he could put wheels on and propel himself with. And then from there, the piston engine using oil and gasoline came into existence in the late 1800s for cars, ships, and planes. And then we got into jet engines. So that's the evolution of technology for transportation. And again, you want to know how they're used. Things such as the sailing ship and how they use the oars and how many guys they have in oars. That's all historical research you can do, where you can go look for to bring realism to your story. Give me a quick look here. Yeah, I'm doing good. So, how do they work? Well, a lot of it's like walk the wheel with an animal. To get to the fourth one with horses, there's actually a technology to saddles. Riding bareback might have been initially, and you just hug the horse with your legs, but it wasn't the most stable thing, as when people started inventing ways of strapping something on a horse that allows you to stabilize your position on the horse when it starts running and turning and doing all kinds of things. So technology of saddles, and that's fascinating. You could study saddles on the internet for like 4 days easily. The evolution of saddles, like when the knights in Europe in medieval times, their saddles had a big block in the front and a big thing in the back because the knight couldn't move. He had a big lance, he had a sword, and the only way he was going to keep all that armor he was wearing on him was to have a saddle that wouldn't let him shift around much. Because if he shifted, there's a good chance he was going to go off the horse. The precursor to modern saddles we see now is more along the lines of what the Mongols were using. Because they weren't dealing with a whole bunch of armor plating and stuff that they were wearing. But they were using archery as a weapon. And to do that, you can't be in a fixed position. The invention of the stirrup was very important in stabilizing a rider. And I believe that dates back to the end of the Roman era in about 400 AD, 350 to 400 AD. Now, the Mongols used it to great effect with their archers, and they could lean out on the saddle gave them a lot of mobility. They could lean out on one stirrup and fire that way, and lean out on the other, and became very adept, and that's what made them very powerful as a military force back in the 1200s. Now, the ship designs, of course, have evolved over the years. Used to be no one was ever going that fast in a boat, so no one ever thought of pointing the bow that much. Even if you look at the ships in the 15 and 1600s, they kind of just plowed through the water. The bows were kind of rounded. And when you get into the 1800s, you start seeing ships more like the Blue Nose and schooners and that. And you look at the bow design there, they're a lot more pointed. It took them a couple hundred years to realize, water does resist you moving through it. Sail arrangements. What's interesting is some of the sails in some of the old ships were triangular like they are now. But somewhere in the Vikings times and all that, they were square. They were easy to make. A big square piece of cloth, put it up. But they didn't give you quite the mobility in terms of where you could aim them. And that went on until pretty well the 1700s, when you start going back to jib sails, and then all sails started to be more, instead of square, being that way, and triangular in shape. So you catch the wind, and when you pull tighter, you can actually make your boat go faster. Researching that, you could do that for like 2 days. And you learn all about the knots that the sailors used that were effective and not, coming loose. And find out the dates when they all happen. And in the engine technology hasn't changed. The overall technology hasn't changed in about 100 years. But the mechanics, not so much the mechanics, the bits and pieces that are on an engine, have changed. Like you still have the piston, the spark plug goes up and down, but how the fuel's put in. And a big thing now is the tolerances. The original engines back in the old days, there was some play in the piston, and so they would wear out faster. And hence, I don't remember when, somebody invented the rings for the pistons, which brought it all that much closer to the wall of the cylinder that the piston ran up and down. It was just enough for a little bit of oil to get in there from the oil pan underneath to create the lubrication. But when that happened, the piston went up and down all that much more efficiently, and there was less wear and tear. And fuel consumption became more and more efficient, and the engine would last longer. So little bits like that, the technology that you could put into your stories, making sure it's in the proper time period. Again, it takes research to look into. The agriculture stream, there's hunters and gatherers, berries and wild fruits and vegetables, and every now and then they'd find a way to get rocks and kill the odd animal so they'd have meat. Then when they started gathering in larger groups, they learned to grow the vegetables and the berries, and basically wheat is the one that basically started to feed multitudes, and cities started to be able to form with large populations around 9500 BC. So as they learned more and more about agriculture, and technology for your agriculture changes over time as well. Inventing the plow, first made out of wood. When they learned metallurgy, they started making it out of steel because they found it was easier to cut through the ground with a sharpened metal blade as opposed to a piece of wood. The scythe, we have a whole bunch of people out there milling, and suddenly you found out one guy could do a whole field instead of 50 people with a scythe, using tractors, move on to combines. Technology of separating the wheat from the chaff, they usually just toss it up in the air on a blanket, and the seeds would separate off from everything else. Now the milling techniques, it makes it a hell of a lot easier and more efficient. So you can follow the technology of how the agriculture in your time period was carried out. And go to buildings, technology of buildings, people lived in caves initially. Used to paint on the walls in France. That evolved to wood and grass shelters because you wanted to be out where the animals were, so you could hunt them easier. Also, people were more mobile, so it got to the point where they would start carrying stuff. And this goes on well into the 19th century with the North American Indians on the plains. They took all their buildings with them, like the teepees. And they had the long poles, they would be dragged behind horses, the cloth and all this stuff. And when they set up camp, the poles would go up and the teepee would be made. In Europe, as cities formed, more and more people were staying in one location. They started working with stone buildings. First, they would just put large stones, and then they learned to make mud bricks, which is kind of what the pyramids are made out of, if I remember correctly. From there, they learned concrete. Concrete, the best concrete in the world, apparently, was made by the Romans, and no one knows how they did it. It was lost in the dark. The technology and the chemistry of it was lost in the Dark Ages. And even today, they don't know how the Romans made their concrete. Because there's buildings still standing that they have no idea how the concrete was made to make it last that long. That led to the creation of durable cities. I've already talked about Nineveh, considered one of the first stone cities in the Middle East. And then the invention of metallurgy moved forward to the invention of steel. After they made swords and that, they found out they could start making modern buildings out of it, the use of glass and windows. The first use of glass and windows research happened around 100 AD. So although glass was around, the Phoenicians apparently found it when they put out a fire, put out their campfire in the desert around Lebanon, somewhere in Lebanon. And they woke up the next morning and there were pieces of glass there because the sand had been melted down into glass. And that's how glass is made. They didn't start putting it in windows until 180 in Egypt. And then again, in the Dark Ages, that technology kind of disappeared. You didn't see windows again until almost 1000 AD. So new and developing technology. Most of this stuff has been since the 20th century started. In medicine, there really wasn't a lot of advancement in medicine through the centuries until the 20th century when people started understanding how diseases and viruses and bacteria worked. And so disease control, artificial limbs. A lot of people have been talking about the pandemic from 1918. It was a flu, but it was they also had no idea how it was spreading. Well, we have that technology. We've learned now through technology how these kind of things spread, and we can do better disease control. And that's like only over the past 100 years. The creation of artificial limbs, that was never done before. You see the pirate with the stick peg leg. That was the technology until pretty well 1950. Communications. The telegraph came out in the 1800s, and they used to run it along the railway lines, so you could talk from one town to the next. But again, that's a very recent invention. The phone, putting up satellites didn't happen until the 1960s. Sputnik was 1957, if I remember correctly, and all it did was go around the world beeping. I don't think it really did anything else. It just was like, yeah, we can put one up there. The internet really didn't start rocking until the late 80s. Fiber optics. You people that are as old as I am can remember long distance phone calls in the old days. Sometimes you couldn't get through because there were only so many wires and you needed two of them to make a phone call. Fiber optics is sending a light signal down a very, very narrow glass tube. And each one can handle 10 phone calls. I think it's 10. Might be more now. And then you have a cable like this with a whole whack of them. Suddenly, unless there's a major crisis going on, you have no problem reaching your party on the phone lines these days. Then you get into science fiction and subspace. Have to figure out what that is. It becomes a norm in Star Trek, so you can have face-to-face meetings when you're light years away. That's probably the one technology they didn't really explain too well in Star Trek. Artificial intelligence and robotics. That advances all since 1960. So that's all relatively new. And if you study the advancements that's been taking place in automated cars and all this stuff and computer intelligence and the like, you can then extrapolate that into the future. And materials. A lot of materials have been developed. I was talking about metallurgy being invented way back when. Hadn't been a lot of advancing until the 20th century. Late 19th century. Steel was steel for centuries and centuries and centuries. Now you're looking at steel alloys that are more corrosion resistance. You have a lot more aluminum being used, especially in aircraft and the like. You have non-metal materials, carbon fiber and plastics. That's all since the 20th century. So if you're writing something in 1747, you better not have a water bottle made out of plastic or have carbon fiber of any sort. So how the technology works, you have to find out the basics of the technology you're going to deal with. A lot of cases, I always start with Wikipedia because it always has some great references at the bottom of the page. It'll tell you when it came into existence and explain to you the basic principles of how they work. If it's a major part of your story, make use of those references at the bottom of the page for more in-depth information. And then you can really show your stuff in your story by having accurate information. How it is used, you need to use it correctly to make it real. Some of the examples, stuff I had to research. In my first book, I had basically a military military unit of cavalry, basically, going across Ukraine. So how far and how fast can you ride on a horse in a day? I had to find that out. When you're looking at somebody dealing with handguns, where is the safety on a particular pistol? It's not always in the same place. And nowadays, when you look at the new technology, you gotta have the right fingerprint and all that just to fire the thing. And there's some where safeties are. It's a bar across the back of the handle which you squeeze before you can pull the trigger. In one from my mineral processing days, how flotation is used in mineral processing. What is the technology behind separating valuable sulfide minerals from the rest of the rock that you don't want? You want to be able to figure out how that works if you're going to work that into your story.
10 minutes.
Oh, I'm doing good. So let's move along here. Extrapolating in science fiction. Now this is an important part. There's a distinct difference between what Star Trek and what Star Trek makes Star Wars look like a comic book. Because Star Wars doesn't explain any of its technology. Lightsabers, blasters, light speed. It's like to throw a few switches and suddenly they're light speed. Doesn't explain any of the theories behind any of that. Star Trek did. They took actual scientific research and knowledge from the 1960s and extrapolated it into the technology on the Star Trek Enterprise. Things like warp drive, folding space. Transporters is based on Einstein's energy E=mc². Energy and matter are interchangeable. Antimatter. It was a theory in the 60s. I don't think anybody had been able to create any yet, but it was a theory, and it would be an enormous, powerful energy source. Dilithium crystals, don't know why they came up with dilithium, but crystals to control light and energy flows is the next step past fiber optics. And it was a big technology point in Stargate SG-1 series. They talked about crystals a lot. And that's from actual technology development as we're going. Miniaturization. If you look at the Apollo 11 landing on the moon, they had like whole rooms full of computer with tape swirling, and my smartphone has more power than that entire room. So this is the thing, and DNA is a new technology that's opening all kinds of things into cloning and medical breakthroughs. You can take do some studying on DNA, and then you can use that to extrapolate into your science fiction. Base your science fiction technology on extrapolating existing technologies. Research is a little harder because usually your technology is a little bit more difficult to understand. But you can go to your local engineering and science departments at universities and colleges. You can find someone who can give you more of a layman's terms. Technical journals are very good. If you ever read Popular Mechanics, you can find about usually cutting edge technologies and get an idea of where the technology is going from that. And from there, use your imagination. For me, I don't use Hollywood in general. They're very lazy with their research. So proper use of technology in a story makes it more believable. And I would only use tech existing in your stories time period, if you're doing historical or even contemporary, know how it works. People want to know that you know what you're talking about. They want to believe that you know what you're talking about when you're explaining something. Especially in science fiction, there's people who actually live and breathe some of the technology. Star Trek fans are like rabid about it. And so on the science fiction side, extrapolate your tech from technology that's available today. And again, research, research, research. Find out what you need to know. Go into it in depth. And then if you just need to put a little bit of technology into your story, it's going to be believable and really drive your story forward better. That, ladies and gentlemen, is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, you got 5 minutes left, so you can ask questions.
Yay. So if there's any questions, I don't know if I didn't have the chat wheel visible to me. But one here says lunchtime, so that was before I started. Time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so. Romans used volcanic ash for their concrete. Yeah, and Pompeii had glass windows. Oh, well, Pompeii.
That was really interesting. Thank you, David, for posting that.
AD, so that's right around when Egypt was putting glass. Yeah, when you get that far back, it's always plus or minus 50 or 60 years. Nobody knows when anything got really established until records were kept, in medieval times. Even there, you got a plus or minus a year or two usually. Can you dodge the techie reputations by invoking Clark's law? You have to explain to me what Clark's law is. It rings a bell, but I can't remember what it means.
Randall, you can put your mic on if you want.
You
get all the board behind you.
Yeah, it was basically any sufficiently advanced technology will appear to be magic to us, to a lesser one.
Oh, well, yeah. If you went backward, perfect example is Champlain hanging out with the Algonquins when he faced off against the Iroquois. He put up this blunderbuss, a big opening, and the Iroquois were all there ready to fight, and he fires and he kills like 4 of them. And they're all going, oh, and they ran away because they thought it was magic. It was just a gun. But they'd never seen a gun before. So yeah, that would be Clark's law. And you would see that kind of thing pretty well in any technological advancement until about the 17th century. People were a lot less superstitious now about technology than they were back then.
But I'm thinking more about in the future when you come up with some amazing drive to get from one point of the galaxy to another, and you don't really have to explain it.
Well, that's it. They didn't really explain light speed in Star Wars, but they did a lot of explaining of how warp drive worked in Star Trek. Yeah. You had the matter-antimatter drive with controlled by dilithium crystals, and the warp was basically warping space in the pockets, so you're actually jumping from one section to the next.
Right. Or the improbability drive.
As to whether it's possible or not, it was a theory in the 60s, and you extrapolate to that. If it gets disproved 30 years later, hey, it was 1968. It worked then. And it's become a mantra of the Star Trek series forever and ever and ever. To the point where even if it's disproved, people are going to believe it now.